Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the Bee's Knees by the Big Cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 7, Day 6. But first, let's do our daily punishment. What did the duck say when she purchased new lipstick? Put it on my bill. Key terms for today are Lyndon Baines Johnson, the Great Society, the War on Poverty, Medicare, Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Immigration and Naturalization Act, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, the Watts Riots, and Barry Goldwater. We're going to be going over Lyndon Baines Johnson's key domestic achievements in the Great Society and its effect on America, his civil rights policy and the new voices in African American civil rights movement, preaching separation and more force when confronted with white racism and violence. So let's start off by talking about Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was profane. He was very profane. He was vain, extremely vain. Always talked about different parts of his body. But he was also very idealistic. He did believe he believed early on in the New Deal. He wanted to create an America that was based on the Great Society that eliminated poverty. He was a master politician. He's considered probably the greatest senator of all times as far as getting votes and creating majorities. And he was a former Senate Majority Leader. He will put his power behind the Civil Rights Bill. LBJ is super interesting. His father was a populist congressman in the Texas House of Representatives. He was really poor, but he did get to college. He was very unpopular in college. He sucked up to the dean. He was called B.S. Johnson, Bull S. Johnson. He's going to teach in Pearsall, Texas, and Houston. When he's in Pearsall, Texas, he'll teach mostly Hispanic students. One of the only presidents that was a teacher. He was a young aide to a congressman, and he's going to. The aides to congressmen have their own little mock Congress, and he became the leader of that. He became in charge of the National Youth Administration in Texas when FDR implemented that in his New Deal. He is going to win the Senate in 1949 by only a couple hundred votes. He'll be called Landslide Lyndon. He will become a master of the Senate. He has a lot of proclivities. He treated his aides horribly, not very nice to them. He did some very humiliating stuff to them to show them who was in power. He had a lot of affairs. He was not a good husband. But he did more for poor people and for civil rights than any president in American history. So let's talk about the first bill that was passed by him, by Congress, which he's going to get to go through, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If you remember, Kennedy didn't really do that much for civil rights. He did propose a civil rights bill before he died, but it was stalled. When LBJ becomes president, he is going to push for a Civil Rights Act. This is going to prohibit discrimination in facilities open to the public. It's going to strengthen the power to end segregation in schools by withholding funds. It's going to create the Federal Equal Employment Opportunities Commission to check for discrimination. It prevents both race and gender discrimination, which will be a big thing for the second wave feminism later on. The Southerners will try to kill this with a lengthy filibuster, but it will pass. One of the great things about Johnson was he was a master politician. This right here is called the Johnson treatment. The Johnson treatment was a lot of Johnson's politics were very physical. He would get up to somebody, he would grab them by the lapel, he would hold them, he would kind of lean over them because he was 6'3". And you could see right here, this is Russell, who was one of his good friends. He was from Georgia. But he's getting up into his space. And with the Johnson treatment, he used his physical body as a form of intimidation just to get a one-up on somebody. Let's talk about his Great Society. LBJ is going to launch a war on poverty designed to help those not yet getting the benefits of the Americans' vast wealth. This is called the Great Society, and we're going to talk about a couple of programs for it in the next couple of slides. Medicare and Medicaid are the central pillars. Medicare is federal health insurance for anyone ages 65 or older. Medicaid is a joint federal and state health insurance that gives people with limited income and resources money. A lot of times we say these things synonymously, but that is the difference between them. In 1964, Johnson's going to be easily nominated to run for president on his own by the Democrats. He's going to run on a very liberal platform. The Republicans will nominate the senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater. He's very, very conservative. He's not like Eisenhower, who is moderate. He's strongly anti-red. He wanted to nuke Vietnam. Very anti-New Deal. He wanted to get rid of Social Security, get rid of the TBA. He believes in a small national government. He's Jeffersonian. He wanted American field commanders to have the authority to use tactical nukes in the battlefield. He wanted to bring America back to the Gilded Age, bring it back to like the 1920s. Very, very conservative. He scared a lot of people, especially with his foreign policy comments. One of the quotes for LBJ's campaign was because Goldwater would say, "In your heart, you know I'm right." And one of the quotes from LBJ's campaign was, "In your heart, you know he's right," versus "In your gut, you know he's nuts." LBJ is going to win in one of the biggest landslides in U.S. history. People were really turned off by Goldwater. He did have a lot of popular conservative appeal. One of the people that speaks for Barry Goldwater is Ronald Reagan, and Barry Goldwater really does create the modern conservative movement, but he is not successful at this time. But one of the things you're going to see is even though LBJ wins in a huge landslide, you're going to notice something about the South. So let's see what that is. So if you notice right here, you see that the South had been Democrat ever since Andrew Jackson. After the Civil War, the South is going to vote Democrat throughout the whole time period. But the Democrats have become more and more progressively liberal, especially ever since the time of FDR. And with Johnson and the Democrats pushing for civil rights, you're seeing the solid South is no longer solidly Democrat. And you're going to start to see the South voting Republican. And this predominantly happens because of their views on civil rights, their views on government programs, and it's mostly civil rights. Let's talk some more about what LBJ did. After he won the election, he's going to have a 2-1 Democratic majority. He's going to create, in both houses of Congress, he's going to create sweeping package of social reform to aid the poor and downtrodden. He's going to continue his war on poverty. He'll create the Department of Transportation and the Housing and Urban Development. He'll name the first Black Cabinet Secretary, Robert Weaver. He'll create the National Endowment for the Arts, which provides public funding for the arts and public television and public radio, like NPR and PBS. We have Lyndon Baines Johnson to thank for Sesame Street. There's really 4 legislative pillars of the Great Society. We have federal aid to education, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act provided funding for elementary, middle school, and high school. So the government's actually getting involved in education now. It's considered like the first real national law for education. It's super important. Medicare and Medicaid. Immigration reform, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. If you remember, before LBJ, like in the 1920s, they were doing quota systems that discriminated against like Southern and Eastern Europeans. They did the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Immigration and Naturalization Act is going to change the quota system, and it's going to increase the quota from people from Latin America and Asia, because before it was favoring like Northern Europeans. So it's going to get rid of that racist aspect. The 4th pillar of the Great Society, which is not on here because we're going to talk about it next, is voting rights. He does the Civil Rights Act, and he's going to do the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These are other things he does because LBJ was a G. He does the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. This creates the Office of Economic Opportunity. It oversees community-based anti-poverty programs. He creates VISTA, which is an American version of the Peace Corps. You could do VISTA and go to different parts of like inner cities or something to try to help out those in poverty. He does food stamps, the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is similar to the arts, but it's for humanities programs. He does Upward Bound. This tries to assist poor children trying to get into college. The Higher Education Act of 65. This gives money to universities for student loans and scholarships. The Bilingual Education Act of 68. This gives schools money to help with limited English-speaking students, ESL. The Urban Mass Transportation Act of 64. This creates the Department of Transportation, more rail and busways. The National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 66. The seatbelt driving speed limits. Before this was controlled by the states. This creates like national standards for like wearing a seatbelt and speed limits. The Truth in Lending Act. This meant that businesses had to disclose the full cost of financial charges when making loans for like banks. The Cigarette Labeling Act of 65. We have to put the labels on cigarettes that they're bad for you. He does environmental things like the Wilderness Act, which is supposed to protect the wilderness. The Wild and Scenic River Act, protect rivers. The Solid Waste and Disposal Act. This is supposed to prevent offshoot dumping of waste in rivers and natural areas. It creates a standardized way of how you dispose of waste. He does Project Head Start, which offers preschool for poor children. He does a lot. He's a G. He is going to do voting rights. So let's talk about that. In 1964, voting rights becomes a bigger issue of the civil rights movement. Even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, voting rights was not fully being done in the South. In 1964, we have the Freedom Summer of 64, also known as the Mississippi Summer Project. This was a voter registration drive aimed at increasing the number of registered black voters in Mississippi. Over 700 mostly white volunteers are going to join African Americans in Mississippi to fight against voter intimidation and discrimination. 2 whites and 1 black person will be killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi. This is going to lead to federal protest, and it will eventually lead to between 1,200 to 17,000 successful registering votes. LBJ, especially after some of the violence, will send in federal officials to oversee registration. Over the next 25 years, you are going to see total transformation in the South. Blacks do start to vote. They are voting Democrat. The Democrats were the predominant ones, although some Republicans did vote for it, that are supporting African-American civil rights. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 makes it easier for African-Americans to be able to vote, and it makes it easier for the government to be able to oversee voters' registration to make sure that they can vote. The Voting Rights Act is going to outlaw discrimination voting practices in the South, because remember they had Jim Crow laws like literacy tests. The 24th Amendment is also going to outlaw the poll tax. That was under LBJ's term also. What's going to happen, however, is you are going to see a split in the civil rights movement, and let's talk about that. In the mid to late 1960s, you're going to see the civil rights movement moving to the north, and it's going to become more out of control of MLK. There's going to be other leaders. We have SNCC, which is going to embrace violence. In 1965, there was the Watts riots. This will take place in Watts neighborhood, which is in the area of Los Angeles, predominantly African-American neighborhood. On August 11th, 1965, Marquis Fry is a 21-year-old African-American man. He's going to be pulled over for drunken driving. After he failed the sobriety test, officers are going to attempt to arrest him. He's going to resist arrest, and the police are going to start beating him up. His mom also is there, and she's going to get hurt. She's going to be struck in the face. This is going to lead to a whole riot in Watts, LA. A crowd of onlookers were there, and they saw this. Rumors spread that the police had kicked a pregnant woman. This is going to lead to 6 days of violence and a riot in Watts. Nearly 14,000 members of the California National Guard are going to have to be called in to suppress the disturbance. It's going to result in 34 deaths and $40 million worth of property damage. It's the worst city unrest since up until the Rodney King riots. All right, next, there will be another riot in 1967, the Newark riots. It's another racial riot caused by police brutality. That's going to lead to property damage. The same thing happens in 1968 in Detroit. There will be new voices in the Black Power movement that are calling for confrontation, violence, and separatism. White people are never going to respect peace. We need to fight fire with fire. Malcolm X was one of the major people. He was a leader of the Nation of Islam. He does support fighting violence with violence to arm yourself and black separatism. Towards the end of his life, he is going to change his mind, and after he visits Mecca, because he was a Muslim, and he will support more of a peaceful stance. He will be killed by members of the Nation of Islam. He'll be assassinated. Stokely Carmichael is another person you should know, along with Elbridge Cleaver. Let's talk about them. Stokely Carmichael was the SNCC leader. He became disillusioned with nonviolence after 1965. He's inspired by Malcolm X. He's going to become a prominent member of that group. Elbridge Cleaver is a prominent member of the Black Panthers. He was the Minister of Information and head of the international section of the Black Panthers. He became a fugitive from the United States. He goes to Cuba and Algeria. He's convicted of a series of crimes: burglary, assault, rape, attempted murder. He will serve time in prison eventually in San Quentin until he's released. He's then becomes a fugitive again after attacking a police officer. 2 police officers were wounded during this clash. Eventually, Cleaver returns to America in 1975. He becomes a Mormon and a conservative Republican, so he really kind of like just changes everything around. The Black Panthers were a Black Power political movement formed by 2 college students, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, in Oakland, California in 1966. They were inspired by Marxist-Leninism, communism. They were active in the United States between 1966 to 1982. They had chapters in many major cities, even in international chapters in Britain and Algeria. The Black Panthers, ever since their inception, their core practices were open carry weapons, so they were not defenseless against police brutality, patrols for cop watching to check for police brutality, and challenging police brutality in the city. After 1969, they're going to focus on a variety of community and social programs to help out the poor inner city African Americans, like free breakfast for children, to go against food injustice and create community health clinics for education and treatment for diseases, like later things for like AIDS and stuff. And Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were the ones that were the founder. Stokely Carmichael, SNCC. The civil rights movement, guys, is going to become increasingly focused on economic demands. MLK goes to parts of the North to focus on economic demands. He does this when he goes to Memphis, Tennessee. He also does this when he goes to Chicago. In both of those protest movements, the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Daley, makes sure that they don't use police brutality, and he's not successful there. But really, he's focusing more on economic demands here in the mid to late 1960s. When he goes to Memphis, it's the same kind of thing. At that time, the protest in Memphis was not going great, but MLK will be assassinated on April 4th, 1968. He'll be assassinated by James Earl Ray on April 4th, 1968. Earl Ray was a convicted felon who had escaped prison by like baking himself into a cake and getting out that way. It sounds crazy, but that's what he did. The king will be assassinated. He was like king even by this time. The civil rights movement was starting to fracture, but he was the leader and the conscience of the civil rights movement. And with his death, it's a huge blow for the civil rights movement. It's a really big deal. Here's Malcolm X. This is the Watts riot. The Black Panthers. Here's the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. All right, kiddos, that's all I have for you for today. Until next time, deuces. Deuces, yeah.